we're ready to confirm that the situation is no longer an emergency. Therefore, the federal government will be ending the use of the Emergencies Act.
Canadian Prime Minister Justin Trudeau, otherwise known as Supreme Leader of the North, has revoked the Emergencies Act before he had the opportunity to become our dictator. Now, this, of course, has left me devastated, as I was promised a communist takeover, and we got nothing of the sort. But let me break down what happened here. So Trudeau today has lifted the Emergencies Act. As I said, this is after 10 days of it being invoked. They never before used extraordinary powers to end border blockades and the occupation of downtown Ottawa by so-called Freedom Convoy protesters. Now, apart from my deadpan joke at the beginning of this video, I am not in support of using this if they were able to clear the convoy without it. So under normal circumstances, this should not have been needed. And I'll get to some more of that in a minute here. But in terms of what they were able to accomplish with the use of this, the moves came 4 days after Ottawa's downtown core was cleared of more than 400 semi-trucks, SUVs, and pickups, thousands of posters and placards, and the remnants of an encampment that took hold January 28th, complete with fire pits, barbecues, hawkers selling protest merchandise, food, a makeshift stage that turned into a DJ-led dance party on the weekends. So, after 3 weeks of these occupiers harassing residents of downtown Ottawa, harassing them as they're on the street on the way to the grocery store, constant harassment in terms of the horns honking all day, all night. I played a clip of that in a previous video in my coverage of this. Just this constant ongoing harassment not being dealt with by the Ottawa police until the use of this Emergencies Act. Now, it shouldn't have been needed. So this is part of the reason why the Canadian Civil Liberties Association is challenging its use, even though it's been revoked. I imagine this is still going forward, this litigation here, because they want to ensure that if it is used, as it was, they want to ensure that it was used in the way that it's supposed to be used, and that this can't just be something that, future governments just bring in willy-nilly and use for anything. So I think it's important to have this, even though in this narrow case, I do support the use of the Emergencies Act. It's still important to challenge it to ensure that it was a lawful use of the act. So more on that here, because you have this, there's solid arguments in terms of the argument against using it, but these arguments essentially rest on law enforcement doing as they should have done, but they didn't. So Nora Loretto here in Passage has a great piece on why she opposes the use of the Emergencies Act, saying in part here, it must be said, use of the Emergencies Act isn't necessary to deal with the convoys. City tow trucks and bylaw enforcement are enough. Even moving the camps off of major arteries and isolating them into adjacent parks or parking lots could have been an option. In Windsor, Ontario, police could have removed the border blockade minutes after it started. Instead, it lasted for 6 days. So I think her argument here makes sense. This wasn't needed, except that it was. The only reason it was needed is because law enforcement did not do their job before this. So part of what they were able to do, the reason they were able to deal with this occupation in Ottawa after use of the Emergencies Act, more on that here. So Toronto Star writes, Ottawa Police, Ontario Provincial Police, and the RCMP all said they used and needed the powers to clear the blockade, especially measures that allowed police to compel tow trucks into service, travel limits, and the ability to declare a huge part of downtown a secured zone, and financial measures that froze accounts and cut off funding to key organizers of the protest. So the best argument I see here is in terms of their ability to actually be able to compel tow trucks to remove the vehicles. They were not able to do this before the Emergencies Act came into effect. Showing you that, at least in this narrow example, they needed to use it in order to move these vehicles, because these tow truck companies and law enforcement in general were not doing their job until this was put in place. That said, if everyone did their job the way they're supposed to do their job, then this would not have been needed. But again, it was needed because they were not doing the job they were supposed to do. Now, in terms of the accounts, so there's a lot of worry about, the freezing of accounts. But they write here, federal finance officials told a parliamentary committee Tuesday that the RCMP and financial institutions had begun to unfreeze accounts of organizers and participants now that the illegal blockades were ended. So all of this was temporary. The Emergencies Act generally is temporary. If Trudeau didn't revoke it after 10 days, it would have been automatically revoked after 30 days. It requires a parliamentary vote, which happened on Monday. The NDP joined the Liberals to support it. But regardless, the Liberals have a minority government. So if they were not able to get any other party on board, they would not have been able to invoke the Emergencies Act past 7 days. So you have these various checks and balances. Another one, the premiers have to actually agree to its use. So Ontario Premier Doug Ford, a Conservative premier, had to agree to the use of the Emergencies Act in his province, and he did. So there are these various checks and balances in place on the Emergencies Act. Again, this is something that was already on the books. This is not a new law. It already existed for use in very extreme cases. And this was viewed as an extreme case because law enforcement and, tow truck companies were not doing their job before this. Now, that said, again, I still support challenging it to ensure that it was used properly. But another check on this power. After 60 days, there's an automatic inquiry to see if it was used properly, how it was used. So there's even more investigation into its use after this. But this point from Lee Carter, I think, is really important on the idea that there's a new precedent that's been set. So I'm gonna try and blow up that BS here. So starting with these couple tweets from Lee Carter, who writes here, one of history's biggest lessons for the left, the capitalist state doesn't suppress fascists often. So when it happens, effing let it happen. Don't jump in on the side of the fascists. That first Hitler, then our turn skit or shit has never worked. Quote, but if they can do it to them, they can do it to us. They're always going to do it to us, whether they can do it to fascists or not. Just be grateful to get a break from it for a minute. He's exactly right. If somehow a similar kind of occupation was done by Indigenous protesters, it would not have been able to last, and that ongoing harassment last for 3 weeks. Everybody, regardless of what political persuasion you are, everybody knows that, because we have seen again and again and again what law enforcement does to left-wing protests, including when it comes to G20. Toronto police actually had to pay $16.5 million to protesters wrongfully held at 2010 G20 summit. I'm not sure if there's images here, but there was insane police abuse at G20. And I mean, you see it here. You saw nothing like this at the convoy. And this didn't go on for 3 weeks. They came down immediately on this protest. You also have various examples of this. Homeless encampment of violence in Toronto betrays any real hope for police reform. I did several videos on the police and the treatment of these homeless encampments that happened over the summer. So again, this was the way they came down hard on these homeless encampments is nothing like you ever saw during the 3 weeks of the convoy. And last example here, of course, there's many examples of this. But from the Narwhal here, Alberta's response to Coote's blockade, proof of discriminatory double standard, First Nations say. When rail lines were blocked in 2020, Alberta Premier Jason Kenney drafted a new law in response, but it hasn't been used at the Coote's barricade. That leaves First Nations leaders ringing alarm bells again about racism and protest policing. So it's absolutely insane to see people like Jason Kenney out right now claiming that Trudeau overstepped his bounds and used too much power. Meanwhile, he brought in a new law to deal with First Nations protesters. But did you see Fox News freaking out about this? How Alberta was under the leadership of an authoritarian regime? Of course not. So it's all just hot air. It's all just bullshit. That said, of course, I am in support of challenging the use of the Emergencies Act. I want to ensure it was used in a lawful way. There's nothing wrong with understanding the arguments on both sides of this from a rational perspective, not from a Trudeau's our dictator perspective, people that are completely insane, but from a perspective where you are worried about government overreaching and using too much power. I think it's perfectly fine to have that kind of worry, but at the same time, understand that in this case, it was used in a very narrow fashion. It was already revoked by Trudeau himself 10 days later. Where's our communist dictator here? It's obviously Those people that claim that were obviously completely full of shit, and they are not going to come out now and admit that they were wrong.